Alright, hello everyone. This is going to be our first of 4 videos that we're going to cover for Unit 5. Unit 5 is a land use unit. As always, a huge thank you to Mr. Smeeds for the use of his slideshows that I've been able to adapt. For our first part of this video, we're going to cover tragedy of the commons, forestry, and sustainable forestry, and mining for our land use topics. The main thing here is understanding what tragedy of the commons is, and then understanding ways that we can try to prevent it. So the general theory of tragedy of the commons is that individuals will use a shared or a public resource in their own self-interest, thereby degrading it. This idea was first proposed a few decades ago, and the observation comes from the fact that when there is no private interest, right, when there is no privately owned nature to a particular resource, individual people will use it because there is no ownership and there is no accountability for it. So tragedy of the commons applies to a resource that must be public, can't be privately owned, and we'll talk about that in a few slides. And it's something that must be either degraded, overused, depleted, used up in some way to the point where it's not sustainably, it's not following under sustainable use. There's a lot of examples we're going to talk about: overgrazing of public lands, overfishing of the oceans, water pollution, air pollution, just to name a few. Now, the reason why it happens is largely due to the lack of consequences. With these public resources, the individuals using them don't feel any consequence from the overuse or the depletion of that resource. Now, the effects may be felt long-term, but in the moment that they're using it, there is no consequence of doing so. And as a result, people will continue to overuse that resource if they don't see any consequences happening. So a main one that we're still dealing with today deals with overfishing. A lot of fisheries in the open oceans have collapsed. You see on the graph there an example of Atlantic cod and how fish stocks used to be very high and then dropped off significantly. We're talking about orders of magnitude compared to where they were a few decades ago. Another example would be air pollution from coal-fired power plants or industrial manufacturing that leads to pollutants being put into the air because, again, if we look at this from the consequence point of view, people that overfish don't feel the initial impact of it, the consequence of it, but it's obviously felt many years later. You can see the decline in the graph there from fisheries, same with air pollution. The companies themselves, or the factories, the power plants that are producing any air pollution, don't feel any consequence or impact from that. What's great about Unit 5 and the things that we'll talk about it is that because we're talking about and addressing some real environmental problems, probably for the first time out of any of our units, a lot of other stuff had just been background. We're also going to start talking about ways to solve some of these problems and looking at some of the costs and benefits to the different actions that that we're going to cover here. So how do we fix tragedy of the commons, or how do we avoid it? Well, since it deals with a public resource, a way to solve it is by making the resource privately owned, whether it's through an individual, an entity, or the government itself. Bureau of Land Management here in the United States is a great example of private land ownership, despite it being the government that's owning and managing those lands. Taxes and permit systems are another great example. Anything that incurs some kind of a cost, as well as fines or laws that would nudge people away from whatever that example is, whether it comes to pollution or overuse of a resource. Now, when we talk about taxes, fines, and criminal charges, we can look at our some of our federal legislation as examples of this. So the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, those all have a hindrance to companies or factories that pollute the air or pollute the water from their actions. So if they're caught doing any of those things that would pollute a public resource, they can be fined or face criminal charges for it, and that's the deterrent in those examples. I mentioned the Bureau of Land Management, and we'll talk about them more in class. All right, next we're going to move on to some of our forestry stuff. So we have two subtopics here, one on clear cutting and one on sustainable agriculture. Clear cutting is a great example of cost benefit. The benefit here is that by clear cutting land, it's economically advantageous. So we're talking about money from the materials that are harvested, as well as clearing the land out for some other use that can generate money, whether it's urbanization, selling of the plots of land that can be used for something else. However, there's a major cost here because clear cutting a forest is going to have other issues, environmental issues that come as a result of it. One we talked about a little bit when we were talking of watersheds in Unit 4, and that's soil erosion. We take the trees out, we get soil eroded. Now that soil can't be used again in that land. It also affects the local waterways, streams and rivers by making them warmer, by making them cloudier, and that makes it difficult for wildlife in those waterways to survive. The soil itself also is going to increase in temperature. So we talked about, again, this refers back to some of our discussion in the watersheds from our last unit. And another example is flooding and landslides. Without anything to hold the soil in place in these forested areas, we lose the ability for that soil to stay in place. It gets dried out. And then with a loss of root structure, we have an increased ability for that land to not only run off, but completely run off during big storms, and that can create dangerous situations as well as completely destroy those habitats. Now, the trees themselves are also areas, because they are habitats to lots of wildlife, clear-cutting entire landscapes is going to be one of the major sources of habitat destruction that we encounter. Now you see in the image up here, and we'll come back to this in a second, but the method to prevent clear cutting, main method is through what's called selective cutting, where specific trees are cut as opposed to the complete removal of all trees. By keeping some trees intact, you mitigate some of these. You reduce soil erosion, you reduce the amount of loss of soil into waterways, and you prevent flooding and landslides. The other problem with clear cutting is sometimes those trees are replanted. Now, when they're replanted in the form of a plantation where we get just the same amount of trees being planted and harvested at the same time, that creates some issues. One, it's going to lower biodiversity because an intact mature forest is going to have lots of different species, and we're replacing it with just one presumably designed to grow quickly, grow well. That means it's also going to be pulling a lot of nutrients out of the soil. And with all the trees the same age, that means that we're going to have no dead trees that can be used for decomposition, and as well as insects. So we're going to not only lower the biodiversity of the trees present, but we're going to lower the biodiversity of the organisms that can now survive in these areas. Now, the other reasons we can look at, some of the benefits to leaving trees present, is going to be through filtering of air pollutants. Trees absorb not just CO2 that they're using for photosynthesis, but they also have the ability to absorb all of the air that they're taking in and store any specific pollutants in the vegetation. Similar to how when we talked about wetlands being a filter for water pollutants, forests can be a filter for air pollutants. We know that they take CO2 out of the air and store it. That removes it from the air, and that's going to be beneficial in lessening the effects that increased CO2 can have on global warming and climate change. And we mentioned habitat for organisms. Forests are going to be some of the most biodiverse areas because of the number of habitats that a forest can provide. thinking 3 dimensions, not just the forest floor, but all of the vertical levels provide habitats as well. Another thing that comes with clear cutting is a technique called slash and burn, which is a negative. So it's not just the cutting down of the trees, but it's the what do you do with the remaining stuff that's there? And typically that material is burned, right? It clears the land so it can be used for agriculture and to remove all the debris instead of having to manually remove any of that debris. Not only are you removing the carbon sinks in the trees themselves, but you're also releasing more greenhouse gases into the air from burning and combusting that material. All right. Now, since we just talked about forestry, we're going to jump all the way down to the end, the last topic here, which is sustainable forestry in 517. So we can talk about some of the alternatives. Now, the concept of forestry is the idea of using trees and taking them out of the environment, but doing it in a sustainable way so that it minimizes the damage. It minimizes the habitat destruction, the soil erosion, all of that. Selective cutting, I mentioned before. This process involves only cutting some of the trees in the area. Typically, it's the biggest ones and the oldest ones. And that's what you see in the top example there. By taking out only those ones, you still leave enough trees there that are going to continue to grow, continue to hold the soil in place, and continue to mature. And then in the spaces where you've removed trees, you'll have spaces where younger trees can now develop amongst older, more mature trees. And that process is able to continue. Strip cutting involves taking out a specific area over a specific amount of time and using that as the way to preserve the habitats, generally preserve the habitats, and keep the soil from eroding. Another way to sustainably remove trees is by minimizing the impact of machinery. So less machinery, more human and animal labor. That's going to minimize soil erosion and soil compaction. Other methods you could see here include replanting the same species being logged to preserve the habitat as well as possible. Using recycled wood or reusing it, repurposing it, or downcycling it is another term that we'll use. Counts as a sustainable forestry practice as well. So rather than harvesting new timber, recycled wood, or downcycled material, you can see in the example here. So this furniture itself was made from wood that had clearly been used for another purpose. Once that wood that has been harvested has been used, finding a way to return it to the environment so it can contribute, maybe not necessarily in the same area, but as far as using it as mulch. And then reforestation, so the replanting of trees in areas that have been deforested, specifically with the intention of not taking those trees out again. So once areas have been deforested, reforestation means replanting them and hopefully leaving them there for a long period of time. Removing dead or diseased trees specifically is another good example of sustainable forestry. So not removing healthy trees and leaving healthy trees present. Now, the thing with all of this is that obviously this involves a minimal amount of disturbance. That's going to have the problem of being less economically beneficial. So we see where the cost-benefit analysis can come in there. Now, fire suppression is another forestry technique. We might sometimes think of forest fires as being bad, but fire suppression is a technique that actually prevents worse forest fires from happening. And we'll spend some more time on this in class. But the idea behind fire suppression is that we want to stop natural fires from happening. So by burning material, early on in the process, we want to, what that's going to do is prevent that material from building up. So ways that we can prevent natural fires from being worse is by trying to prevent future fires from having impacts. And we've seen a lot of this right here in New Jersey recently. From all of the dry weather that we had, we saw some pretty bad forest fires happen in the northern parts of the state as well as in central and southern New Jersey. And fire suppression techniques are really helpful in preventing those really bad fires from happening. Now, thankfully, we haven't dealt with some of the major issues we've seen in other places like California and New Jersey where we live. But there are some sustainable methods to good fire suppression. And this is what we call a prescribed burn. So when we get the buildup of dead material, sometimes it's good to just burn it as quickly as possible. And what that will do is prevent it from building up and then creating larger, more dangerous fires in the future. These small controlled burns are able to also help promote the return of nutrients back into the soils and then back into the natural movement and cycle, as opposed to just being a buildup and slow decay of that organic matter and slow decomposition. Because if they get back in, we can get new growth, and new growth is going to have a less likely chance of burning and causing larger fires as well. Now, the prescribed burn stuff we'll look at in a little more detail in class as well. But I want to make sure we get to our last topic, which is going to be mining. So our last topic for this first part is mining. And mining is the removal of the land in order to take minerals and materials out of the Earth's crust. So a couple of the vocabulary terms here. The material itself is called ore. We typically refer to this when we're talking about minerals and metals, but we are also talking about mining in the context of coal and oil, which we'll get into more depth with in our energy unit. The stuff that is under the ground is called a reserve. It's the amount that's still there that can be mined. And it's usually measured in how many years left of extraction at current rates it can support. This can be decades to hundreds of years, depending on the material. The term overburden refers to the actual natural soil and ground that's removed. So that's the soil, the vegetation, the rocks that are moved out of the way in order to access the ore and access the mineral deposits. Tailings and slag are terms that are used for the leftover waste material. So once that stuff is separated, it's usually the material that's been left over, what's not needed from that mining operation. Mining happens two ways. It happens through what's called surface mining or subsurface mining. Surface mining is common for a couple of different types of minerals, lots of metals, coal, for example. It's generally viewed as the safer practice for people and for mining, but because it is happening at the surface, the trade-off is that you're going to have more environmental effects. Because it's happening at the surface, all of the impacts of the mining are felt by all of the local environments. So open pit mining is very common, strip mining as well. These are done by creating these large open areas, removal of that overburden. Mountaintop removal as well is especially damaging because we are physically changing the topography and the landscape on hilly environments. So a lot more material is removed, and because we're typically dealing with large slope topography, a lot more things can run into nearby habitats and streams, not necessarily just in the areas where the mining is occurring. Now, as ore near the surface becomes more scarce, subsurface mining might become the main method of accessing it. So when we have our surface mining, the things that we're concerned with are all of the removal of that overburden that leads to erosion, that destroys habitats, and that's going to affect water quality as well as decrease air quality. Now, subsurface mining is the opposite trade-off. It's more expensive because it's more work to dig that deeper, and there's more protocols that have to be put in place. So there's more risk to the workers themselves. We have gas buildups, mine collapses, as well as long-term health impacts that we've seen, such as things like lung cancer from old coal mines and risks of explosions. The benefit, though, is that all this underground mining typically has a lower, lessened environmental impact, since we're not affecting nearly as much of the surface. So what are we concerned with as far as the environmental impacts? So one is acid mine drainage. So whether we're talking about subsurface or surface mining, mainly we see this with the subsurface because we have a lot of rock exposed. And what happens is water gets into these mines and it mixes with the material inside. You don't really need to know that it mixes with pyrite, but you do need to know that the water gets into the mine and acids leach out of the water. Acids and heavy metals then get into groundwater, they get into local waterways, and then that's going to affect the aquatic life that lives in there. It's going to make it more acidic. It's going to make it, there's going to be more toxic metals that these fish are exposed to, and that's going to kill them. We also have the release of methane, right? Since we are underground and there was decomposition in these areas, we've got methane gas in these rocks, in these coal deposits specifically, that'll be vented out to prevent explosions. But by venting it out, we're adding it to the atmosphere, and methane is a greenhouse gas. We also have something we'll talk more about in air quality, which is particulate matter. That's what PM is here. So that's physical particulates that get released into the air like soot, and those particulates can irritate and harm human and other animals, as well as all the other things we mentioned from erosion, habitat loss, and turbidity in the waters. Now, one thing to note as far as benefits, though, is that mining does require reclamation. We have a mining reclamation, Federal Mining Reclamation Act that basically says that anybody that mines an area has to restore the land to its original state once that mining is finished. Now, this could be decades down the road, but it is still a way to hopefully ensure that once that mining operation is done, we get the land back to normal. Almost think of it as reforestation, but for a mined area. While it might not be forested, at least replanting of the original native plants as much as possible and getting as close to original as possible is the idea here. Now, with things like mountaintop removal, the changes are so drastic that it's not always the most feasible thing that this will happen. But it is federally mandated that once mines are finished, as mines move essentially, and we'll talk more about that through an area, the land that's done being mined and has been used up needs to be restored and reclaimed to as much of the normal original state as possible. All right, that's going to cover our first topic unit for land use and all the things that we're going to get into in this part of our unit in class. Thank you.